Thank you. I'd like to very much appreciate the organizers for the chance to come here and speak, and for your gracious hosting and moderation of this panel. It's been a great panel. I have esteemed colleagues here that I've known for quite a while, and I also have some new friends and acquaintances here, which I'm very happy about. I'm the president of the Jamestown Foundation, based in Washington, D.C. Vlad Sokar is one of our senior fellows there. I've been focusing on Ukraine and national security issues for about the past couple of years. And there's 3 points today that I'd like to talk about. And I was asked today to speak, principally about where is Ukraine in the international system and why it's not working or functioning. And so I'll address that. The second point that I will talk about is Ukraine's national security dilemma and identifying its national security priorities and how it reacts to those threats. And the third thing, which may be surprising for you, is that I'm going to actually discuss briefly the case study of one of those national security problems, which is the Ukrainian Navy. Everybody talks about Donbas and the army.
And it's all of that in 5 minutes, right?
Yes, absolutely. But as anyone looks at the Ukrainian national symbol, the trident is very much a part of that national symbol. Ukraine has 3,000 kilometers of seaboard with the Black Sea. 20% of your GDP comes from the sea and maritime commerce. So that's very critically important to Ukraine. And so that's the 3 points that I'll talk about, and so in less than 7 minutes. But Ukraine in the international system and why it's not working. First of all, I appreciate your comment about Voltaire, as Ukraine is a land of Europe, but is unknown to Europe. And I would echo that point by American national security policymakers, as Ambassador Herbst has talked about. U.S. policymakers keep looking at Ukraine through the prism of Russia's imperial history and Russian history and Soviet history. And so in many ways they're having to relearn that process. And I think that's a very critical point that Ambassador Herbst has made, because how we look at Ukraine in the international system, as when Ukraine gave up 3,000 nuclear weapons, in many ways it kind of stopped being a national security priority and issue for the United States. And one of the problems that Henry Kissinger has talked about, that in his experience of trying to educate Americans about, is something called the balance of power. And he had understood, tried to teach Americans that there's something called in Europe the balance of power. And where Ukraine fits within that is in the regional balance of power. I think Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, someone that I worked with for 4 years, who constantly talked about geography and the need and importance of history, once said that Russia cannot be an imperial power without Ukraine. And that's a very critical point, because if Russia was to occupy Ukraine, it would once again be a Balkan power. It would be on the doorsteps of Europe in a way of it being able to constantly continue to influence geography and influence the balance of power. But that's what Russia's imperial goal is. And so this is one thing that's very critically important, because Americans don't really understand where Ukraine fits. In 1943, an American political scientist by the name of Nicholas Spikeman wrote a book called The Geography of the Peace. This book was very influential because it influenced John Foster Dulles, and when George Kennan wrote The Long Telegram, he tried to identify the issue and strategy of containment. But Spikeman talked about the importance of geography and of geopolitics, and this laid the seeds at that time for the importance of how the United States looked at the idea of containment. In 1946, there was something called the Straits Crisis with Turkey, which led to Turkey joining NATO. When Stalin tried to control the Straits, and there was this major international crisis. And so this led, as we're here today talking about the Yalta, the influence of Yalta. Again, what we are seeing here now, and with the 2015 annexation and occupation of Crimea, is that back again, the Black Sea region and Ukraine are very much in the forefront of what American policymakers are looking at and trying to understand Ukraine. There's a debate now in the United States on whether to give Ukraine Javelin anti-tank missiles. Ukraine is very much in the forefront of what we're thinking, but Americans don't understand where Ukraine fits within this national security priorities. But even within Ukraine itself, there's problems with understanding its own national security priorities and strategies. And that's something that I'll briefly get to here today in my own discussion. But how Ukraine looks and identifies its own national security threats is very interesting. You know, I keep telling many Americans, friends of mine, who talk about tiny Georgia threatening to get the United States in a war in 2008 when the Russians invaded South Ossetia and Georgia fought a brief 4-day war with Russia, a nation of 3 million. The point that I try to make about Ukraine is stop thinking about Ukraine as if it's Georgia. Ukraine is a nation of 45 million. It is a nation that had 3,000 nuclear weapons. It gave those up. It has a modern industrial capacity, and basically it has the ability. It's a country that once built aircraft carriers. And so there's a problem in how Europe and the United States look at Ukraine in terms of what it could be, what its potential could be. As the mayor of Lviv spoke at the beginning about the conversation with Lieberman, Ukraine has to survive. Well, that's very much true. And the problem in Ukraine is they keep looking to answers like the javelins. They think that that's going to solve all of Ukraine's problems. And I would disagree. The problems of Ukraine are really deeper and much broader in its national security than just getting Javelin anti-tank missiles. The Ukraine problems today and challenges is you have vast amount of resources and people. You're rebuilding an army, but you're a country that in 25 years of your independence, 23 years beginning with the war in Donbas, Ukraine, with a large army like it had never organized a military exercise in its 23 years of independence, never had a military exercise larger than 1,000 men. Ukraine had a military, but it didn't know how to fight for its independence and fight for its struggle because the military had been so ignored. And now Ukraine is looking at its military as a way to try to rebuild and identify its national identity. And that's very important. But there's certain national security strategies and priorities in Ukraine that they're not focusing on, that they're not doing. 3 years after Donbas, Ukraine does not have the ability to produce its own ammunition. This is a critical national security priority that's not being paid attention to. It's not because Western companies are not offering you things. They're offering you the ability to build your own ammunition plant. But the government is turning it away. And why? Is that the responsibility of the United States? No. We're here to help you. But Ukraine has to defend itself. It has to accept these offers to build its own ammunition plants. Ukraine has its bureaucracy is its greatest enemy. Ukraine can be a modern military power if it overcomes the challenges and problems that it has with its national security. Currently today, there's a major security crisis going on with the building of the Kerch Strait. Here on the map, you can see the Kerch Strait. It's very visible. Kerch Strait began as a crisis in August 1st. For 2 weeks, the Kerch Straits was cut off, supplied. Everyone talks about Donbas, and Donbas is of very strategic importance. Well, Kerch Strait, if it's closed off, Kerch Strait is the gateway to Mariupol. And if Mariupol and Donbas cannot export steel, Russia will strangle Ukraine in Donbas. So Ukraine, and it has a maritime priority. It is trying to rebuild the Navy, but if it loses the Kerch Strait and the ability to control it, when this crisis emerged in August 1st, officials in Kiev were on vacation. The crisis was happening. The straits were closed. Nobody said anything. Officials did not, they had meetings at the National Security Council in Ukraine. High-level officials from the military and also from the various other offices, I won't mention the names, but they didn't even go to the meeting. Okay? This crisis right now is becoming greater and greater. If Ukraine cannot if Mariupol has to start closing the steel plants because it cannot export the steel, it will have a major effect on the Donbas. And why am I talking about this? And I'm talking about this because Ukraine has a vision for its Navy. It wants to build a Navy. This week I participated in a conference organized by Admiral Kavanenko, who's sitting here in the audience, retired Admiral Kavanenko. They tried for the first time, a branch of the Ukrainian Armed Forces had a public event to discuss its strategy. In Kiev, this is unprecedented. They're discussing their strategy. They had a U.S. Rear Admiral coming from 6th Fleet to come and discuss this. It's very critically important because they're openly talking about the problems and their issues. The Ukrainian Navy wants to send naval vessels into the Kerch Strait to exercise what they call freedom of navigation. They want to show that those straits are open and there's freedom of navigation, and that the law of the sea, the UN Convention, is being open and being enforced. But this won't happen unless Ukraine does something about it. The other part about the Ukrainian Navy is that part of their vision of building a Navy is to get help from the United States. Sitting in Baltimore Harbor are two what they call island-class cutters. And these two island-class cutters are a gift from the United States to Ukraine. But they're sitting there, and they've been sitting there since July, and they're not moving here to Ukraine. Why? We don't know. We can guess as to why this is not happening, because there's certain naval shipyards that exist in Kiev. They're building vessels there called the Gurza class boats, and some people believe that these boats and the naval yards, that the island class cutters are a threat to these boats, because the problem with Ukraine's national security is that it's also becoming a money-making venture for national security. And we've got to really talk about this today, get this thing moving, and get it further discussed, because the United States is offering to give Ukraine certain weapons that are in the island class, which could be used in the Kerch Straits, but it's not happening. And so this is a critical priority. Ukraine has to survive, and geography determines your future. So I think this is very critically important. I very appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And so if there's one thing that I could leave with you in the audience, is the idea that the Trident is also about the sea, and it's also about Ukraine and its maritime commerce. And I would say one thing, that the United States Navy began in 1794 with 6 frigates. They were constructed by the U.S. Congress, and Ukraine destroyed, it had 70% of its navy was destroyed and taken by the Russians in the invasion of Crimea. You're trying to rebuild a navy, and you're starting again, just like the United States did in 1794. You're starting with your own ability to rebuild a navy, and they have a vision for that navy called the Mosquito Fleet Strategy. And they're openly talking about it to the public. And it requires public support for this strategy in the Navy. But the people, Mao Zedong once said that the army swims with the people and the nation. And so Ukraine has the people, and the volunteer battalions have to get together, have to develop ideas and strategies and work with that, so that you can develop Ukraine's national security strategy in a way that's very balanced, and that you become appeal to the United States, and that you survive based upon not just us helping you, but Ukraine helping itself. Thank you.